Hello everyone and welcome back. In today's video I will be going over some balance suggestions that the community and I came up with on stream after a lot of discussion. If you wanted to voice your opinions and participate in these discussions live, you can stop by and join us every Wednesday, Thursday, and Saturday. So with that out of the way, let's jump right in. So I wanted to start this video by giving credit where credit is due. Riot Games has done a good job of addressing some of the balance issues so far. They nerfed a handful of the cards that I was hoping that they would during the last balance patch, and they did it in ways I was hoping that they were going to do it. So they've really set a good precedent, and I just hope that they can keep it up. Let's jump into these cards now. First up, from Demacia, we have Stand Alone. Now, this card is very heavily talked about, and it's has just really ended up kind of calling attention to some of the other outliers in the game. It's not necessarily a problem with Standalone itself, it's more of a problem with elusives, right? The elusives getting this buff in the early game, your opponent just playing like Green Glade Duo in the early game, curving into Standalone is just a recipe for disaster. There's other cards like Solitary Monk as well, which really abuse Standalone, even cards like Zed. So if those cards were to be addressed, then Standalone maybe gets to exist in its current form, but as it stands, it's just a little bit too strong. They might give it the treatment that they did to back-to-back and just increase the mana cost by 1. I could see a world where maybe it's no longer burst speed and it's just fast speed. Could be a nice change to it. Furthermore, the HP buff is a little bit rough, where you can use Standalone to tank through a removal spell and still keep on trucking. There was a suggestion that came from the community that rather than giving HP, it gives barrier. That way you still get that ability to get a really valuable trade, or, again, tank through that removal and keep on going. This does give some extra synergy to barrier-focused stacks, stuff like Shen, so that could be a little bit dangerous, but at the very least, maybe the HP is toned down. Maybe it's something like +3/+1 or +2/+2. It's very obvious that Riot Games likes to do very even stat buffs. So maybe something with the numbers here, but Standalone definitely needs to be looked at, and I know that Riot will make the right choice. Next up, we've got Hecarim. Very, very obvious choice to be on this list. Everybody's been talking about Hecarim. He's been like S tier since the beta, of course. In the earlier versions of like Elise Spider aggro that I was initially building, everybody was thinking about running Darius, and I was just running Hecarim, right? Because it's just, he's a board in a box. If your board gets wiped, you play him on 6. If Hecarim dies, you just play Rekindler and get Hecarim back. He's so good as just a one-card package. If you've got the champion slots and you're running Shadow Isles, you just run Hecarim. It doesn't matter if you have the ephemeral synergies or not, if you're late game, if you're mid-range, if you're aggro, Hecarim makes the cut. He's just so good. And the developers have already gone on record saying that they want to make his ephemeral synergies more prominent in his kit. So hopefully they'll figure out a way to do that. But the starting point for me personally, we talked about this on the stream, is Hecarim losing Overwhelm. This takes a little bit of flavor from the card. Hecarim is like this undead cavalry horseman that just runs you down. It's very thematic, and it makes a lot of sense for Hecarim to have Overwhelm. However, that keyword is very out of line when it comes to Shadow Isles as a whole. Shadow Isles has a lot of very massive units like Vilemaw, Scuttlegeist, etc. that don't have Overwhelm, even though it kind of looks like they should. They just have Fearsome instead. If Hecarim had Fearsome, it would probably, again, it would just add to that issue of there being a lot of Fearsome in the game. But the thing about ephemerals is that they just want to go wide. They aren't necessarily just punching through you. And if Hecarim didn't have Overwhelm, it would go a long way into taking away his finishing potential as well. Because that's one of the issues too with constantly reviving Hecarim, is because he has Overwhelm. And with the 2 Spectral Riders, the chip damage that you're taking from these subsequent attacks is quite massive, especially with things like Mark of the Isles, which we'll get to later. So Hecarim, is already going to be looked into, so loses Overwhelm, maybe goes down to 5 HP. I'm not exactly sure how they're going to buff up the Ephemeral synergy. The one suggestion that came from the community was that he has lower base attack, but then gets more attack as there's more Ephemeral allies. This sort of dips into Iron Harbinger's flavor a little bit, but it comes down to whether or not you mind followers and champions having like a little bit of family synergy, so to speak, because Iron Harbinger is sort of like a baby Hecarim. Another change that was potentially suggested was that to the Spectral Riders, instead of 3-2, they become 2-2. And that is also a very interesting change to tone down some of Hecarim's power, but that kind of hurts the card Onslaught of Shadows, which is a very awesome spell that you can run just in Ephemeral Synergy decks. So I'm looking forward to seeing what they do with Hecarim, but at the very least make him lose Overwhelm, so that if you're able to somehow survive through the constant pressure, you aren't just taking chip damage on the Nexus. So next up in Shadow Isles, we have Vile Feast. This is a personal inclusion from me. This one hasn't been very widely discussed by the community the way some of these other cards have, but it is my opinion that Vile Feast should only deal 1 damage, not drain. The extra healing is there, again, it's sort of a flavor thing, like with Hecarim's Overwhelm, where because it's a Vile Feast, and like the spiders are, eating the enemy, it's the draining one and the healing makes sense just for the thematics of this card, but it just adds like a little bit of extra power for no reason to what is already a very solid card. 2 mana fast speed, deal 1 damage, summon a 1/1 is still great. And taking away the healing trims a little bit of the power off of control. And then, the normal, like, spidery, aggressive decks that are going to be running Vile Feast don't get benefit from having some sustain for no reason. So next up, of course, you knew it was coming, Mark of the Isles. 1 mana burst speed, give an ally +3/+3, and ephemeral. So almost every card game thinks that they can take a cheap buff. Let's make a cheap buff spell that gives a ton of stats and has a downside, and somehow that's balanced. But the issue is that if you're dying the turn your opponent plays Mark of the Isles, it doesn't matter if if the unit dies, right? If this buff has a downside, if they just end the game, especially because it has the such enormous stat gains on the HP and attack. Your opponent can use Mark of the Isles to have their attacking unit tank through a removal spell to still complete their attack, or just have it just trade up into something. There is a little bit of counterplay with Mark of the Isles, though. If you have something like Single Combat or Purify in Demacia, you can sidestep this to either cleanse that buff or just make the ephemeral unit die to whatever single combated it, but instead of it hitting its original target. But I think it's safe to say that having to play around 1 mana give 3 over and over and over again is pretty rough, especially with just how much good stuff Shadow Isles has. I think it's important for the developers to really think about what they want the region to be. Do they want it to be, with all the removal and stuff and the very powerful late game, it's very obvious they want it to be controlling, but a lot of these other tools that they do have to help out with other archetypes like aggression, especially like the ephemeral aggression, are just so generally good that you're just going to run them regardless. So one change that was suggested for Mark of the Isles was simply that the ally that you cast it on has to be ephemeral already. Make this a really, really powerful synergy buff for those aggressive ephemeral decks. That way it's easier to predict the targets, you can play around it. Furthermore, the player that's using this card gets value because their opponent is baited into having to block their ephemeral units, right? Which would normally just die anyway. Your opponent would rather leave them unblocked. And with Mark of the Isles existing, your opponent has to generally, take that risk anyway, right? Can I afford to take 3 more damage here from Mark of the Isles, right? Or 6 more, whatever the the outcome might be. If your opponent's tapped out, then you can stack as many Mark of the Isles as you can muster onto one thing. So that would be a very interesting change to just make this an ephemeral only card. If they were to make that change, then we would just see obviously the aggressive decks pivot to Elixir of Wrath, which is 1 mana burst speed, 3 attack, but it just doesn't give the HP buff. You see, you lose out on that utility of HP buffing something so it tanks a removal spell or what have you before it completes its trade. And I think that that's one of the bigger, that's definitely one of the bigger issues with this card. There's also the synergy with Deathmark, where you can grant Ephemeral to something and then use Deathmark to take the Ephemeral off, right? You're taking away the downside of Mark of the Isles and then killing an enemy unit, which is really, really rough to be on the receiving end of if you don't have the proper tools to interrupt that combo. At the very least, they probably need to make Mark of the Isles 2 mana to cast, or another change that could be used to trim some of the power off of this card, some of the utility, would just change it so that you can only cast it on a battling ally. That way, those weird turns where your opponent's like setting up a really fat elusive unit or a Darkwater Scourge or something, they want to buff it up and then pass the Ephemeral off with Deathmark, they at least have to have that unit participate in combat. So yeah, there's a little bit there, but that's really all I can think of. Mark of the Isles, I wouldn't mind if it just didn't exist and it was reworked into something else entirely. Next up from Shadow Isles, we have Frenzied Skitterer, another card that sees some discussion, not as much as, Hecarim and maybe other cards, but Frenzied Skitterer is an absolutely insane card for sure. I initially wasn't sold on this card because I was thinking about it too linearly as just a spider synergy card, and I was thinking to myself, if I have a board that's, a wide board of spiders, why do I want to pay, why do I want to develop another unit rather than just attacking in and then, might get punished by Avalanche or something. But the thing with Frenzied Skitterer is, alongside it just being, good stats, a 3 mana 3/3, it's also fearsome, right? So it's a good attacking unit on its own. And then it has this AoE debuff. So if you are playing against a fearsome deck or anything of that nature, you run the risk of your opponent just playing Frenzied Skitterer and disrupting your ability to get early tempo against a fearsome deck or to line up some really good stat lines against that turn. Furthermore, with Frenzied Skitterer, it debuffs and then it threatens maybe a really, really strong trade on, an offensive turn or even on the defensive turn. We're also starting to see control decks run this straight up just because the attack debuff shuts down so much damage that potentially comes from aggressive lists. They're incentivized to just not simply attack at all because the Frenzied Skitterer is going to be getting too good of trades. So there's a ton of ways you can rework this card. Some suggestions have been make it 4 mana. Others have said just make it 2/2. If you were to make it a 3/2, it plays more into what the spiders already do, where they have sort of mediocre HP, which I think would be acceptable. There is like Arachnoid Sentry, which is a 3/2 that has a similar punish my opponent for developing something sort of effect. And then this one just comes through in Shadow Isles. But that's really all you can do, is probably just make the stats a little bit worse if it was a 3 mana 2/2. I think you just really want to stop this from seeing play in non-fearsome / non-spider decks, right? So probably just make this lose fearsome altogether and see what happens from there. But for sure, this card needs to be nerfed. Next up, we have the Rekindler. Now, this is a very interesting card because Rekindler itself theoretically is not overpowered. It's mostly just Hecarim, right? If Hecarim wasn't so strong, then Rekindler would be a little bit worse. We've seen decks run Rekindler for just like really greedy late game value with Karma, with Ash, with Anivia. And the issue with Rekindler is that its effect is very, very powerful, and even if they nerf Hecarim, it's only a matter of time before some other champion becomes the very egregious target of its ability. Just getting like those really big champions back at a discount, sometimes at even cost or a discount, and then you get a 4/4 body along with it. One thing I would like to see with the Rekindler is rather than it being an on-summon ability, make it an on-play. That way, if there's other abilities that are reviving the Rekindler, it itself is not proccing again to also revive champions. Another very interesting idea I've seen suggested by the community was change this from revive the strongest allied champion to revive the weakest allied champion. The weakest keyword, or like, you know, I don't know what you'd call it. The weakest criteria is already present on Rasa the Sunderer, so there is coding in the game to read what is the weakest champion. And what this would do is that if you want to play the type of deck that's running the Rekindler to double and triple down on your very late game champions, then you have to give up those early mid game champions as well. You want it to revive one specific type of champion, and that's all that you get. And I think that would be a fair trade-off for the insane types of value this can get. And again, this is another card that I wouldn't mind just getting completely reworked, simply because this wording with strongest allied champion, it's only a matter of time before another Hecarim joins the fray, and Rekindler is just bringing him back and breaking you over the breaking you over turn after turn after turn of value. This card was already nerfed from a 5/5. If they were to make it like a 3/3, especially if Hecarim isn't nerfed, like that's probably as good as you're gonna get. It is 6 mana, but this ability is absolutely insane. So that was the Knighthood suggestion for the Rekindler. Next up in Shadow Isles, this one, I'm not gonna lie, is probably more of a personal change, because the only thing I want changed is revive the 6 strongest allied units. The fact that Harrowing brings back the enemy units that have died over the course of the game is just so devastating. When your opponent's just running nothing but removal and things like Ruination and what have you, and they're just getting your units back to finish you off with, it just feels so bad. They're able to dip into other regions, which isn't something you really see a lot in Runeterra. At least not the regions that are, outside of your deck. Some of you might not know is that cards that generate random cards, like Karma generating random spells, the spells she generates are only from the regions that are the 2 regions that are in your deck. And the Harrowing sort of like breaks the fact that the random cards that you're getting could potentially be from regions that are outside of your deck. I've had some really silly games where my opponents use the Harrowing to get like my Garens back, and then the Rekindler starts bringing back Garens because those now dead champions go into their pool of dead things for the revival. It's kind of nuts. I think it was very apparent at first that the Harrowing was supposed to be like a finisher card for ephemeral decks. You're getting potentially your Hecarims back, your Shark Chariots, etc. for just one big final swing turn. The power of this card is definitely a little bit more now that Deny has been nerfed, and you can definitely still run Deny to answer the Harrowing. But again, I would rather this card be run in a deck that is looking to revive and resend their own threats back at you, rather than just controlling the game and sending your own threats back. So moving on to Ionia, the card I have here is Zed. Very powerful card. And the only change I really want to make to Zed is simply that it doesn't create a Living Shadow with his stats. That's literally it. Zed already is a very powerful champion on his own. We've seen decks now where he's getting very consistently buffed with things like Omen Hawk, running a lot of backup protection with Elixir of Iron or Twin Disciplines to make him very hard to remove from the board. But the fact that the Living Shadow is being created with his stats means that any sort of buffs that you're able to cast onto Zed just get automatically duplicated, and that sort of value is a bit too much, I think, for Zed. I don't mind if this carries over to his leveled up form, where the Living Shadow is created with his stats and keywords. That way the Living Shadow also gains quick attack. But the issue with Zed is that there's just so much value in his level 1 form rather than his level 2 base form. You don't really need to achieve that goal to unlock his power. He's just strong on his own. And it's, again, the same thing with Hecarim. You don't need to level him up at all. A lot of you might even be struggling to remember what Hecarim even does when he's leveled up, because very rarely do you see it. You never need to level up Hecarim. He's just good on his own. And I definitely wouldn't mind Zed being changed, just so that buffing him doesn't result in just like these crazy, like, one-sided, you know what I mean, just like stomp fests. You're already incentivized to block the Living Shadow because his level up condition is based on either him or the Living Shadow attacking the Nexus. And the Living Shadow base would still be a 3-2, which I think is perfectly acceptable. He's just a 3-2 that summons a 3-2, and he has quick attack. And just go from there. Next up, Navarre Conspirator. There needs to be a discussion about elusive as a whole, but it is my opinion that Navarre Conspirator should not have elusive at all. It's the value you get from recalling an ally. It seems, here's the thing, right, is that Navarre Conspirator as a 2-mana 3-2 with elusive is a very powerful stat line for just starting to go aggressive on your opponent. And the downside, right, of playing such a powerful unit is you have to recall an ally to do so. But the issue is that in the decks that are running Navarre Conspirator, you're going to be running these very high value 1-drops like Omen Hawk, Inspiring Mentor, etc., or even like Navarre Blade Scout that you want to replay because it'll regain elusive for that turn. The downside isn't really a downside. And Navarre Conspirator just enabling these weird synergies is very cool, and I do like that design, but it needs to lose some power, right? If you're recalling an ally, there needs to be some sort of tempo loss there, and Navarre Conspirator just kind of makes it up in spades, because on turn 2 you hit for 3, then turn 3 you hit for another 3. It comes down too early for how much damage it does, and it just needs to lose elusive so that we can focus more on the power of recalling an ally. Next up is Ezreal from Piltover Zon. Now, again, barring discussions of elusive as a whole, the funny thing is that elusive on Ezreal doesn't really matter right now, because the current style of Ezreal is simply waiting for him to level up and then just OTKing your opponent with his leveled up ability. One thing I would like to see them change with Ezreal is make it so that you have to target enemy units 8 times with spells. This will make it so that he doesn't benefit so strongly from the Frostbite package, things like Iceveil Archer or even Avarosan Marksman. As they add more effects like that to the game that are going to be targeting your opponent's units, Ezreal is just going to be getting stronger and stronger. The same thing with them adding more spells to the game. The issue becomes, the big issue with Ezreal as a whole right now is just, of course, the Elknuck thing. Gives it a bit too much consistency to get to that late game combo state without enough interaction. So they do definitely still need to figure out Ezreal as a card rather than just addressing those issues, because it's one of those things where it's only a matter of time before that same sort of scenario creeps back into the metagame. So it's better to take this opportunity to move Ezreal into a healthier state. Furthermore, when Ezreal is leveled up, I would like to maybe see the damage dealt per spell just as 1. We've already seen like the Machine Gun Shadow Reaper Anduin meta from Hearthstone. It's very, very boring. It's very repetitive, and it's not really very fun to watch. Furthermore, you have to remember is that when Ezreal's leveled up, he has 2 attack, creates a Mystic Shot, so that's 2 damage, plus 2 damage, and then his ability procs, and that's another 2 damage. So leveled up Ezreal will deal 6 damage to you, theoretically. And if they're in a tight spot, that Mystic Shot doesn't need to go to the Nexus. They'll just use it to clear your board. And I feel that was like the initial vision for Ezreal, was that, with Elusive and Nexus Strike, he's a champion that consistently is generating these Mystic Shots in order to keep the board under control and just deal chip damage. You could maybe even change Ezreal so that you have to target enemy units a specific amount of times with Mystic Shots. This adds a little bit of RNG to the mix because you have to draw the Mystic shots out of your deck and you're relying more heavily on the Mystic shots that Ezreal generates. But maybe if they're adding more things down the road of generate a copy of a spell in hand, stuff like that, more counterfeit copy type issues, you can just go like full Mystic shot, and it plays more into Ezreal's like kit in general, as him being based around landing those Mystic shots. So hopefully they'll address that before, you know, Ezreal theoretically gets nerfed and then comes back, because nobody wants to see him come back, I don't think, in this state. Next up, we've got Troupe of Elknucks. I've already touched on how it lends a lot of unnecessary help to the Control-y Ezreal decks right now, because it gives you a very powerful mid-game roadblock for the opponent. The big issue with Troupe of Elknucks is that the original game plan that a lot of people were honing in on was just duplicating the Elknucks with electro rigs and counterfeit copies, etc. And so until you build up like this huge board of Elknucks, potentially the Elknucks have been buffed by Hearthguards and Omen Hawks and whatnot, and then you just go to town on your opponent for one big swing turn. And I actually do not mind that particular style of Elknucks. When you actually are building your whole deck around them, it's a very, very telegraphed strategy. It has a lot of weaknesses to aggro, loses to things like the Ruination, you know what I mean? Will just completely answer the Elknuck turn if you go that late, things like that. But the way the Elknucks are being used right now, people are just going YOLO on 5 and then getting anywhere between just a 3-3 in stats or a full board of a 3-3 and a ton of 4-5s that can just end the game. And that sort of like swingy RNG fiesta is not healthy in any card game. It's not good for Runeterra, and it goes against the intended design of Troupe of Elknucks. The suggestion that came from the community to remedy this was simply to make Troupe of Elknucks cost 8 mana, potentially with a stat compensation, make Troupe a 4-4 or something. And basically, because you're saving Troupe of Elknucks for the later stages of the game, the mana cost increase doesn't matter too much. The other issue with Troupe of Elknucks being played on 5 is that it thins potentially a lot of cards out of your deck, and so then you're drawing your other removals and whatnot more consistently. So I wouldn't mind seeing a change like this for sure. Another change potentially could be is that it summons copies of Troupe of Elknucks, not just all Elknucks. That way they can still print more without Troupe of Elknucks being broken. And then that way you have to double down and triple down on counterfeiting multiple copies of specifically Troupe of Elknucks. So, and then that would be like a subtype, and then maybe other Elknucks just kind of get added into the mix if they add more synergies. Like if you have an Elknuck on board, do this the way they have with Yetis. So that's a change I definitely would love to see, because that deck I think is pretty fun, and I don't want Elknucks to be abused in any Freljord deck that has 6 slots open. You just run it. And those are the cards I hope that Riot will change in the upcoming balance patch. I don't know exactly what they're going to do, but we can only hope, and I definitely still just want to keep the discussion going. If you saw any changes here that you particularly agreed with or disagreed with, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and if you want to maybe have some of these discussions and participate along with the community, don't forget that you can do so every Wednesday, Thursday, and Saturday. So I will see you then, and you have a good one.